The story of this team does not have a happy ending. I figured I would be upfront about that, and warn you before you watch this video. This is not the tale of Sisyphus, as you might have thought it was. There was no more imagining someone happy, there was no slowly making progress and overcoming challenges. This is a story of flying too close to the sun. This is... Okay, that was dramatic. Though really, how else could a video like this start? I mean, look at the length of it. It's very long. Indeed, welcome to the finale of Railway 3 with the worst teams possible. If you've made it this far and have been watching in chronological order, as you should be, you already know the rundown. But let me give you a brief recap of the fight so far. Easy, surprisingly easy, extremely difficult to the point of tears, also extremely difficult to the point of losing all normal human emotions, the continuation of never feeling anything again as I sit in pure silence and win clashes for an hour and a half, and then pure, unadulterated bliss. I think that's a pretty sufficient summary of the journey so far. And while it seems like we are 60% done with this challenge, I'll be transparent. Making the first two parts of this video was really hard. Not because of editing or anything like that, but because my mind was so occupied on these next 4 fights for so much longer than any of the other fights in this railway that I basically forgot any of the previous ones happened. That may sound ridiculous considering how frustrated I was with Clam or Drenched Gossipium, but you'll see. Before that though, I need to talk about my team going into this last segment. And while there are 2 different teams, one for Segment 3 and one for Spiral itself, I'll only be talking about the Segment 3 team for now. So ESGOO, what was the fight you built your team around in this segment? Haha, that's a great question, viewer. Let's look at my graphic again to see which fight I thought would be problematic. It was Pecan Trio. That won't come as a surprise to most any of you watching, at least I hope it's not a surprise. Pecan Trio is a 2-wave encounter, which starts off with a wave of Pecan Town grunts, and then moves into the main event, fighting Starbuck, Queequeg, and Ahab herself. The specific and obvious problem this fight posed was that it required both a hard DPS check in the form of Queequeg's shield and a tank check via Ahab's absolute onslaught of unopposed, unclashable attacks. Now that would be concerning enough on its own, and let me tell you, it was. Pecan Trio was always at the forefront of my mind, to the point where, near the beginning of this run, I told myself that if I could just get past Pecan Trio, I could consider this a 1 challenge. And honestly, while I was worried about getting stuck on Pecan Trio, the next fight basically convinced me that even if I got past it, I would be screwed. Gas Harpoon is a fight that has a hard DPS check in her last phase, gaining a whole bunch of shield, doing a whole bunch of counters, and lowering my SP. Now you might be thinking, hey, isn't that everything you struggle dealing with in every fight? Why, yes. Yes, it is. But let's not linger on that too long. There is plenty of time to discuss the issues these fights posed, but let me stay focused on how these issues shaped my team. If there's one major looming threat that is a through line in all of these fights, it is definitely pierce damage. Half of the mermaids deal pierce damage on most of their attacks, the Pecan Trio is mono pierce, and Gas Harpoon is almost entirely pierce as well. Also inconveniently, almost everything in this segment resists slash, with the only enemies that don't resist slash being Queequeg and Starbuck, but even they are just neutral against it, making it so we again have a worst damage type by far. Just like Segment 2 was with Pierce, except here, Pierce is actually the best damage type, ironically enough, so we can't use it. Let's look at Pierce damage first, specifically taking it, which immediately eliminates Base Faust and Base Dawn from my team, since they both resist Pierce, and they also deal actual Pierce damage. And speaking of dealing Pierce damage, Enrodian and Leo Merceau were also booted for similar reasoning. And yes, while Leo Merceau is Pierce Fatal, and that is bad, don't worry, because so is Base Merceau, who I brought instead. I didn't really think about Rose Spanner Merceau at the time, and I think there is a solid argument for him being worse for this segment than Base Merceau, notably how he is far worse at being a tank for Pecan Trio while still being Pierce Fatal. Really though, I think his offensive stats and speed are just a little bit too good. especially since Queequeg is blunt weak and having stronger blunt attacks would be helpful, not to mention his Tremor synergy and attack power down, and by the way, these conditionals activate on Tremor potency, not count, because once again, God is dead and PM can't write things, and even if I didn't have Effervescent Corrosion Rodion for basically infinite count, this would be an easy conditional nonetheless, meaning his rolls are far better than they initially seem. Again, solid argument for him over, or I guess under Base Merceau. He might be better at being worse, is my point. But I went with Base Merceau, and we already know why Base Merceau is bad, so I won't bother going over his kit in depth again, and the same goes for Sloshmill, who seems like an odd choice, since she is another tank. But she is Pierce Fatal, one of the very few Pierce Fatal tanks in the game, meaning the prospect of her tanking Ahab's Prey Mark phase were minimal at best. Now, since we kicked Rodion to the curb, let's bring in our third new Rodion ID this run. Yes, Rodion gets 3 different representatives. So, oh wait, never mind, that's a bad thing. Well, a warm ESGOO welcome to Base Rodion, who is Pierce Fatal and not particularly tanky. Even worse, she is Mono Slash, and her rolls are mediocre. Well, no, mediocre is generous, and just mediocre wouldn't cut it anymore in this segment, as we'll soon talk about. Base Rodion sports a 2 to 5 speed range, making her not very fast, and her only real upside is having a skill called Slay, which that's funny, I guess, innately. I think, no, yeah, she kind of fixes my lack of gluttony I've had throughout the entire run with her skill 1 in combination with Effervescent Corrosion, and yes, I didn't even think of trying to bring Rhymeshank this time. Effervescent Corrosion is just strictly better once again. The last newcomer is not a newcomer, technically, but Chef Gregor, who deals mostly slash damage and is Pierce Fatal. Now, despite having some actual renewable health via his passive, and access to Leisure Domain and Lantern, one of which was never actually used during this run, I'll let you guess which one that was, Chef was still really terrible in this segment, since Leisure Domain's Sin resistances make him fatal to Sloth, and how terribly convenient that Queequeg and Gas Harpoon's counters are Sloth Pierce. Did I forget to mention that Sloshmill is also Sloth Pierce Fatal if Snag Harpoon was the last used ego, which it often was. This long list of team changes still means that BL Otis and Zwei Sinclair are on the team, which I think goes to show just how bad they are. Yes, Otis could deal good damage once to Pathos Mathos was ramped up, and Sun Shower was really good, but her actual kits, especially for this segment, though she did have the sole Pierce skill on my team. And Zwei Sinclair is still Zwei Sinclair, despite everyone's recommendation that he changes that aspect of himself. Except, as a fun fact, Zwei Sinclair was the only ID on my team to not be fatal to Pierce. 5 out of the 6 would take 2 times damage from all Pierce attacks, and Zwei Sinclair, by default, was Pride Fatal, which was an incredibly common Sin affinity in this segment, and while Lifetime Stew could change those resistances, he would end up Sloth Fatal, which is also pretty common. If the team recap seemed short this time, that's by design. I'll be talking about the nitty-gritty of each new skill and ego as they come up, since there is just so much to talk about in the actual fights themselves. One last thing to mention, at the end of segment 2, I had Base Gregor on the bench, and now with Chef Gregor, I obviously had no more Gregor support passive to be able to use, so I went back to the absolute worst support passives for this segment, with basically the same support passives as in segment 1, just with W Faust on the bench, providing charge to literally no one. The preamble's out of the way now, it's time to enter the final segment of the run. Let's see how past ESGOO felt going into it. It has been 9 days. 10 days, actually 10 days since I last attempted Railway 3 with the worst team possible. After beating Order Blossom Moth, I said, okay, great. I did the first part of the challenge, the first, I guess, 6 tenths, and now I am terrified. This is the really scary part, and I'm sure in the voiceover where we talked about why this team is so bad, but in case I didn't, 5 of my 6 IDs are Pierce Fatal. And if you know anything about this railway, you should know that that is the worst thing possible going into this. So I am fully going into this expecting that this is not possible. with my current rules and current setup, but I'm going to give it the best chance I can, and time is the limiting factor, since if I spend too much time on this, the video never comes out, which is the video I want to release. So, yeah, I'm really hoping this goes well. I expect it will not. Mermaids aren't going to be a problem. Sorry to interrupt it and pause it. Did you hear what I just said? Mermaids aren't going to be a problem. Yeah, that's the sound of a dumbass who has no clue what he's getting into. So, remember this fight? Mermaids, right? Well, this fight is also mermaids, so just welcome to that but again, is what I wish I could say if that were true, in the slightest. Porous hand mermaids are a completely different fight, and calling this node mermaids doesn't really sell it right. I prefer to call this the Pallid Brigade, because that sounds way cooler and is far more fitting, and I promise you I will not stick to that naming scheme throughout the entire video. As I said in that clip I just played, it had been a while since I did the challenge, and can you blame me? I beat Moth triumphantly and wanted to ride that high for a while, forever, ideally, honestly, but I knew that pain awaited me and I needed to deal with this segment. And as such, I thought I could just storm on through this node easily. I could not have been more wrong. Now look, I won't trick you into thinking this is a clam situation, but this was still pretty bad. The Pallid Brigade is when my offense level and rolls being low across the board started to really show. You see, back in segment 1, something like Sloshmill's skill 2, which rolls a 13, could reliably win most any normal clash when at 45 SP with Snag Harpoon's passive up. However, now we are dealing with negative coin skills that have high ceilings, which is only further increased by this passive, where mermaids gain offense level based on the amount of other mermaids. This meant that attacks were just difficult to win against, especially when all of them are alive, which is the most problematic phase anyways, because there's so many skill slots. The politified LCCB enemies actually weren't too bad. Their rolls are on the lower end, but the politified twin hooks have strong skills that would often lead to turn 1 resets in order to win against them, especially since my sanity was quite low after Ardor Blossom Moth due to Zwei Sinclair dying near the end of the battle, which is not my fault by the way, it just kind of happened. I definitely didn't just let him die, but that lowered SP across the board. Even worse, I had no access to representation emitter on Faust anymore, since, well, there's no more Faust. Now, why do I mention negative coin skills as being a downside specifically? Well, one of my main strategies I used in Railway 2 to win clashes I otherwise couldn't was to use Chef Gregor. With his 3-7 speed range and a skill 1 and 3 that inflicts paralyze, he was a great option to reduce opponents' coin power to 0 for my other IDs to clash and win. Except, negative coin skills have high base power, and applying paralyze is actually really bad here. Taking chip damage on this wave of the Brigade was basically unavoidable, but to keep it to a minimum, Zweinclair was obviously a top priority to preserve health on, and Chef Gregor was the safest ID to let soak some spare damage due to his 8 HP healing a turn. Having this alone was a huge relief, but it still wasn't nearly as useful as having a base Gregor on the bench. Another issue was that I knew Pecan Trio and Gas Harpoon were beyond this node, meaning I needed to farm resources, and a whole lot of them at that. Even before actually attempting these fights, I knew they would be very demanding on my resources, be that health, sanity, or actual ego resources. I needed to conserve all of those somehow across the 3 nodes. This meant I had to go back to ego resource stalling, though I really didn't do this as much as I maybe should have at first. I wasn't exactly sure what resources I would need most, but I tried to focus on Gluttony above all, since I knew Legerdemain and Sunshower Otis would be very useful for Pecan Trio. The first wave is basically nothing compared to wave 2 of the Brigade. Now, the real fight begins. See, I knew this part of the fight would be annoying, since these mermaids just lower my sanity by a ton whenever I'm above 20 SP. This would happen each turn and made it so RNG was a real big issue. Especially since farming resources was easiest on wave 1, meaning if I were to farm for, say, 10 minutes on wave 1, only to get immediately destroyed by sanity RNG on wave 2, that means I've just wasted, like, 12 minutes. The alternative to trying to use my regular attacks was using ESGOO, setting me back even further on some resources that would end up being pretty precious later on. There was just one saving grace about this wave, and honestly it's hard to even call it that, but it's this guy. This mermaid in particular heals other pallid mermaids for an amount of HP based on the amount of other mermaids alive. This meant I could keep both of these healing mermaids around and farm resources pretty safely, since they would forever, very slowly, heal each other. This was useful because I couldn't get all of the sins I needed from just my defensive skills. The issue is, that meant that the other mermaids would be constantly healing as I tried to isolate these two, and as I'm sure I don't need to remind you, my damage sucks. So undoing some of my damage dealt for the entirety of Wave 2 really hurts. I think I felt that the hardest in this segment, and probably in this fight the most, because I tried my best to use as little ESGOO as possible. ESGOO could often substitute for my lack of damage, but here it felt bad to use it. Another thing that really sucked about this fight was that the pallid mermaids have their stagger thresholds up very high. At least these ones do. Meaning that I could stagger them immediately on turn 1, which was good, but they would then likely heal back to full due to the healing, and then their second stagger threshold will be far lower down, and I could only ever really focus down one mermaid in a turn, and that's if I used almost every single skill slot or had my nuke skills, which, yeah, looking at them on screen, oh my god, wow, what a nightmare. The thing that made this even worse was that if I got hit and I was the lowest SP in the fight, I would lose 10 more SP from Suncliff. And the mermaids could inflict sinking, lowering my SP even more. Oh yeah, they also have this Lust Pierce skill, which always required an ESGOO, since half my team would take more than fatal damage from it, and it rolled way too high to deal with it normally. And yes, as I foreshadowed all the way back in part 1, these guys explode. All of them have this passive. If a mermaid is below 10% of their max HP and get a hit off, they die and inflict 20 SP damage to me, which was often kind of worse than taking damage, since lowering sanity meant I was more likely to lose future clashes, or I had to use ESGOO, which meant losing more sanity, which meant needing more ESGOO, which meant losing resources. It's kind of a snowball effect that a lot of people don't think about in Limbus, because it usually doesn't matter, but here, it absolutely does. This could also stack with the Suncliff support passive loss, and by the way, dumping Envy is no longer in the cards. I would need every bit of it for Picard Trio and Gas Harpoon. It's a vicious cycle, and also meant that farming was a little more limited and just harder to pull off, since using a guard would mean they explode on me if low enough, and if I lose SP from Suncliff eventually due to sinking, lowering me to the point of being the least SP, which absolutely happened, then I just lost more SP. And using evades, sorry, did I say evades? Freudian slip. I meant evade, singular. If BL Otis's evade dropped a coin at any point, I could also just get hit and exploded on, or just take a whole bunch of damage. This makes grinding for resources awkward and tilting. I hate to admit it, but this was a very frustrating part of the run. Immediately, we're back to it. Yay. Thankfully, the third wave has 3 big mermaids who do not stack up in terms of difficulty. Speed ranges were the biggest problem probably, since these big boys had 2 skill slots, meaning if they rolled high, that was 2 attacks at high speed. While yes, I do have access to Snag Harpoon Bind and Effervescent Corrosion Bind, there was nothing I could do against turn 1 speed RNG. This also only got worse when there were more enemies, since Snag Harpoon can only bind 1 enemy, and Effervescent Corrosion's bind, while AoE, is inconsistent, and it cost resources I needed to preserve, notably Sloth. Yeah, I don't know exactly how, but Sloth would end up becoming a huge issue, and probably the biggest bottleneck resource of the entire run. This is another reason why you could argue Rose Spanner Merceau is worse, but he still has a Sloth guard, just like base Merceau, meaning his Sloth output is technically the same in a farming setting, and by the way, despite being a worse tank, his guard is better for some reason, because base IDs have terrible defensive skills. Anyways, those are all 3 waves talked about, but it really didn't go as smoothly as that. Wave 2 really is a problem, and I knew I ideally wanted to be within one lifetime Stew's range of health lost or less, and hopefully have no one at or below 20 SP going into the Pecan Town portion of the Pecan Trio fight, but that was less of a priority. Farming resources and maintaining HP/SP, those don't go hand in hand. But I'll talk more about this stage and its consequences later. For now, all you need to know is that I made it through after just around 2 hours. Now that doesn't sound too bad compared to some of the other fights I've talked about. You're right, but also, oh so wrong. I won't be ranking the Pallid Brigade on the Painometer. You'll know why later. But I will say that this fight gave me a small, tiny iota of an idea of what was coming. Higher offense levels, high rolling skills, and for the love of God, RNG. Mostly those first two, the real RNG would come later. I used to think this was a boring fight before I did this challenge. Now I think it's a boring fight that also hard punishes your sanity and makes it hard to recover if you lack damage on wave 2 of the fight, which just feels bad. As I've talked about, I don't really like forced SP loss mechanics, and while this one isn't technically forced, in this team, it very much is. MVP ID/ego of this fight would end up being a skill. Base Merceau's Guard for Sloth Generation. Yep, things are that bad where I am giving out awards to defensive skills that roll a 13. And speaking of those, I could also give this to BL Otis's Evade, which allowed me to farm Pride, but Sloth would end up being a lot more valuable. So, coming out of the Pallid Brigade, let's once again see how I felt as I entered Pecan Trio. Please. Be hilarious. Okay. We can still kill. We're fine. Let's go. Okay. Okay, we can attempt Pecan Trio. That's not a good thing. But it is a thing. I can't really describe my feelings, but I think I prepared decently. Farming on that stage was a lot harder than I thought it would be, but coming out of that with 20 Pride is pretty good. I don't want to go back, so if I go back, I think I might have to change some things, but I'll think on it. I don't want to throw in the towel too quick, so... Alright, stage 10. Okay, so this might be the fight you clicked on this video for, and I don't blame you. But if you clicked on only this part of the saga because you wanted to see Pecan Trio and the end of the run, that's fine. I get it. But just help me out. Subscribe, like the video. I assure you I have earned your subscription with the amount of pain I have inflicted on myself. And as for this fight itself, terrible doesn't even begin to describe this note. I cannot express. It is literally impossible for me to convey to you properly my experience with Pecan Trio. I will be trying my very best, so forgive me if this segment drags on, but I think you deserve to get the full story of this fight if you have watched this far into this series. This node has its own arc. The Insanity arc is over. Welcome to the Depression arc. But depression is the 4th stage of grieving, so of course we gotta start at the beginning. Welcome to Denial. Beating Moth on my first try gave me some unwarranted confidence, and I thought there was a slim chance, no matter how small, that I could get through this in less than 6 hours. I told myself the longest I would spend on this fight would be 8 hours. We'll see if that ended up being true. Welcome to Pecan Town, where dreams go to die. And yes, I said Pecan Town, not Pecan Trio. We aren't quite there yet. On my first attempt at this fight, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was feeling the fight out, doing a scouting run, and I don't blame myself for definitely playing this really badly, since these enemies suck. Pecan Town villagers basically have the same mechanics as mermaids, but are genuinely about 95% worse. While they actually gain less offense level than the Pallid mermaids do, their base rolls are just so much better, and their skills so much worse. Javelin in particular might be a skill that makes you tremble in fear and PTSD due to Mirror Dungeon, where it is relatively infamous as a skill that rolls incredibly high. This wouldn't be nearly as much of an issue if they just hit tails, but Pecan villagers heal a ton of SP basically every round. They do heal less when more of them are dead, but how do I kill them? Well, with a ton of ego, or slowly, which was the strategy I would eventually adopt. Ego had to be used to clash against certain attacks. There was just no way around that. Specifically Javelin, Protect the Town, and Tear Up Wound, and yes, that is over half of the attacks they use. I'm glad you noticed. Tear Up Wound could be won against with Sloshmill's skill 3 or Chef Gregor's skill 2 if he was faster than the opponent by 3 or more, but I'm sure I don't need to tell you about how that is inconsistent at best in multiple ways, both in actually getting those skills to be able to use and then actually winning with them. Protect the Town is a skill that tricks you into believing it's winnable when it's really incredibly unlikely, if at all possible. I basically have to not drop my coins for all 4 of the attacks, and then it rolls a 10 or a 12 on the last coin, which will likely be boosted to a 13 or 14 minimum due to offense level differences. So I also would have needed to roll above that final highest value. So Bealotus's Evade was sometimes used, but Ego was just the far better and safer option. Even then, some of the ones with lower floors could lose against it, specifically Branch of Knowledge and What is Cast. And speaking of Branch of Knowledge, this is where it had to be used the most in the run by far. I'd used it maybe once in Ardor Blossom Moth, but outside of that, it was basically unused in Segment 2. However, even though Sloshmill was back on the team and should have theoretically drawn some fire, Zwei Sinclair was targeted in this fight more than ever, meaning Branch had to be used. And once again, it would just keep hitting heads over and over again, which meant it cost 20 SP, and there was really no way of refunding sanity for Zwei Sinclair outside of his skill 3, which was RNG reliance because my SP would have been lowered by that point, and then that meant he had 10 aggro the next turn, which meant using Branch of Knowledge to end up losing 20 SP, and then you just go negative on SP anyways. I will be talking about Pecan Trio more, don't you worry, but following my first attempts, I made my way through a messy, suboptimal Pecan town just so I could at least see the trio with my own eyes. From here, oh boy, I had no clue what I was doing. I kind of just threw some attacks into Ahab and generally clashed. I put Prey Mark on Zwei Sinclair, not realizing I had changed to Branch of Knowledge's resistances the previous turn, so he died, and then quite quickly, everyone else followed suit. I really don't know what I was thinking with my strategy here, but I was weirdly hopeful after seeing how much damage certain Ego did. Sunshower Otis in particular would end up being very good against Starbuck, who was weak to Pierce and Gluttony. The issue was obviously going to be surviving the Prey Mark phase, but I was beginning to formulate a plan. After some consideration between Zwei Sinclair and Base Merceau, I chose Base Merceau to be my tank for Ahab's attacks, at least initially. Despite his fatality to Pierce attacks, Chains of Others' Ego passive was just way too good to pass up, and the Ego made him take less damage from Pride attacks. Chains of Others gives me 2 protection next turn on heads hit, combined with the 3 extra protection from the passive meant I was counteracting the plus 50% damage bonus from Prey Mark, but it was a little bit better than that, since the 4 attack power down from Chains of Others would also be reducing the inherent rolls and damage of her attacks. However, getting Prey Mark on Merceau came with the issue of speed ranges, since I needed to redirect Ahab's attack that applied Prey Mark with Merceau, so he would have it next turn, which meant the bare minimum for my plan would then become Snag Harpoon on Ahab first turn of the Pecan Trio fight to guarantee she will be at 1 speed so Merceau can redirect. Then the next turn, use Chains of Others and hit heads for protection next turn, then break Queequeg's shield on that following turn. The last part's I hadn't quite figured out how to do that yet, and it came with its own slew of issues. On my first run through, I just ignored Queequeg's shield, and that didn't work out very well. I was confident I could survive 2 rounds of Ahab's onslaught if I used Merceau with the Chains of Others strategy. The issue came with keeping up the pace and actually making progress from there. So about an hour and a half into Pecan attempts, and my 3rd time reaching Pecan Trio, I had managed to be able to try tanking with Base Merceau. Keep in mind, there's quite a lot of luck required to get to even this point in the fight. Like, here is my second time getting to Picantrio, where the attempt immediately ended due to speed ranges not favoring me on turn 1. Rousseau just died, not a single thing I could do about it. This wasted about 20 turns, which is way on the lower end for how long it could take me to get to Picantrio, but it was still incredibly frustrating. But, attempt 3. I get off Chains of Others, and wow, that damage is really good. Only just about 60 damage? Well, before you get too excited, the next turn I was swiftly killed due to Starbuck's speed RNG, destroying me. Starbuck is rarely a problem in normal gameplay, but he was quickly proving himself to be incredibly dangerous, even if he was frail. I was going to have to exploit that weakness of his if I wanted to make any actual headway. Now from here, I stopped having footage of all of my attempts, but it was clear something needed to go better, and I decided to focus my efforts on taking less damage. I may have forgotten to mention this, but I need to come out of this fight with no deaths. Via my own rules, I was only ever allowed to use 6 IDs, and though I strongly considered bending that rule, I never did. Why is it so important that no one dies, though? Well, because of Gas Harpoon. This is another situation like Segment 2, where the final fight dictated how the previous fights had to go, which is to say, they had to go very well, and unlike something like Ardor Blossomoth, where you can luck into a victory, Gas Harpoon's final phase I knew would require basically every bit of power I had. Gas Harpoon would gain at most about 110 shield HP, and even if I depleted all of the Queequeg, there was no guarantee I could close out the fight, since my team would likely be in complete tatters. This was obviously extremely daunting, since while I did go into this segment with the expectation of it being impossible, as I sank more and more time into this fight, I realized I was less and less satisfied with the idea of barely winning against Picantrio and calling it there. I wanted to win. So, what else did I come up with? Well, thankfully I am very smart, and I didn't even know it. You see, ever since Limbus first came out, there was an ego I always kinda just ignored. And that's most of them, to be fair, but the one that's relevant that I ignored was Screw Loose Wallop. This ego is interesting. It applies Surgery, which lowers your max HP, but increases your damage dealt. This is useful for dealing more damage into Queequeg, but I would be debuffed by Chains of Others anyways. So why am I bringing it up? Surgery doesn't seem very good here. And you'd be correct. Surgery is not good here. In fact, it is actively bad. But Screw Loose Wallop is still good, because it only applies Surgery to the user when it's actually Thread Spun. Mine was Thread Spin 1. And as such, it only applied 3 Paralyze on heads hit and 3 Protection after attack. Even better, this made me take 0.5 times damage from Pride attacks. This came with one problem though. The protection is same turn, so I had to use this the same turn I would be targeted by Ahab, and since I was always at 1 speed and so would Ahab, as far as I know, this was a 50-50 chance for me to go first and actually get the value from using Screw Loose Wallop. Funnily enough, it's actually good that this protection is same turn, since otherwise it would be unusable since Chains of Others had to be used the previous turn, but still a 50-50 didn't feel very good. In addition, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, I was going to get use out of the 2 damage downs Vi Sinclair inflicts on his skill 2. This reduces damage dealt by 20%, which was perfect for this situation, but this meant the amount of RNG and or strict planning needed had just increased a ton. So, let me briefly go through almost everything I had deduced I needed to make this fight maybe work. Turn 1 of the whole encounter. I reset until I see 2+ defensive skills and as little Wrath and Pride as possible. All of the sloth skills that the villagers have are manageable enough, and ego usage needs to be minimized. So I would usually try to stagger at least 1 Picard Town villager on this turn, or at least get them close. I wouldn't always abide by this rule, but it was optimal and could generally save me resources I would need for Picardrio. I wasn't able to grind as many resources as I wanted to from mermaids, so I had to play as conservatively as I possibly could have with every resource that wasn't Wrath, Lust, and Pride. The rest of Picard Town could be mostly freestyle, with emphasis on using base Merceau's skill 1 as often as possible to generate sloth, and sometimes stalling with one Picard Town villager alive and waiting for them to use a guard skill and then attack into the guard to keep them alive while generating resources. I would also try to finish them off with lifetime stew, which meant that once I had to really optimize Picard Town, the odds I got to Picard Trio per actual attempt was about 10% by my very rough estimate. And, of course, hitting tails on Lifetime Stew was just by far the worst way to end up losing, since that would be about 25 minutes into an attempt sometimes. And re-rolling for double defensive skills and good skill RNG in general would often take about 2 to 3 minutes. And there was no guarantee that beyond that point, the rest of it would go well. So, about an hour and a half since the last time you saw these three, I made it back. Now, it's important to note that in order to have Suppress, Zvi Sinclair's skill 2, ready for turn 2 of the Picard Trio fight, I would either need to save it in the bottom slot and not use Branch of Knowledge on this first turn, or Lifetime Stew, but that was easy enough to not use, or it would need to be my upcoming skill going into the Picard Trio fight. Some of my other strategies were a bit more advanced by now too. Sunshower Otis would always be fired off into Starbuck in order to deal massive damage. However, I often got unlucky and had to go unopposed into him, but Starbuck was an X factor I often didn't want to deal with, so Legerdemain and Effervescent Corrosion were often used to clash with him or Queequeg to ensure he wouldn't be an issue for a while. This is taking advantage of his weakness to Gluttony, and I have never been more thankful for an enemy to have a million stagger thresholds. Queequeg has a single coin envy skill that I would often just straight up eat in order to secure more damage for turn 1 on Starbuck. Killing him meant a rare sanity boost in a fight I really needed it on. I thought of it as a way to gain tempo in a sense, since damage into Queequeg was mostly pointless at this point. In this particular attempt, I used Roseate Desire into Ahab instead of Snag Harpoon, which I later realized is not optimal, but it was an okay enough option. I was sure to utilize Legerdemain's Paralyze when I could to make unfavorable clashes work in my favor. The only issue with that was needing to rely on heads hits, which meant more RNG. However, since you are seeing this attempt, you already know that ended up working out. Now, turn 2. This was a simple but incredibly crucial flowchart. Clash against Track them to the end with Chains of Others, which you remember I'm sure, and then hit Ahab with Suppress. Sunshower was often used against Starbuck again for more big damage and to guarantee he is staggered during the Preymark/assist defense phase in order to be able to focus my damage on Queequeg better, and also so I just didn't have to think about him. I had to take some risky clashes along the way. Sanity was a precious resource, and losing clashes wasn't an option for several reasons. This is why using Roseate Desire on turn 1 of the Picard Trio portion is incorrect, since it uses up 20 sanity instead of the 10 that Snag Harpoon would take. Of course, this sanity struggle led to more RNG. Thankfully, this was generally the least stressful turn, so long as Chains of Others hit heads. Damn it. Well, Zvi Sinclair's Suppress basically worked as 2 protection, but I wanted to have all my stars aligned. It's a shame it didn't work out, but I carried on, obviously. This next turn, though, was one of the scariest. Breaking Queequeg's shield was something I knew was possible, but only just barely. In addition, I needed someone who wasn't Chef Gregor to be going first. Queequeg's counter hitting heads literally does well over 100 damage to him. Sloshmill's ideal since I can reduce the damage down to basically nothing with Roseate Desire. It sacrificed some of the damage Snag Harpoon would otherwise deal, but I felt it was worth it since it made me no longer Sloth Fatal and just reduced the damage overall with offense level down and Paralyze. So whereas a Sloshmill would normally take around 80 to 90 damage on heads hit from the counter with Roseate Desire up, it would deal just around 25 damage. HP was still a valuable resource, and being staggered could easily mean losing too much tempo. It's not like getting past a single Preymark phase meant we were home free. Now, breaking Queequeg. The most consistent strategy was all about ego spam. Nothing more, nothing less. And Queequeg's resistances almost could not be more terrible for my ego. Gluttony ineffective hurts super bad, and being Pierce ineffective meant that any damage Bale Otis could otherwise do was probably in the low 10s. In addition, I couldn't afford to go all out. Just look at my resources. At minimum, I would need to survive another cycle of Prey Mark. If I rationed out correctly, it might just be enough. The most important thing to me was hitting the 50-50 on Screw Loose Wallop. More resistance to Pride and more protection would mean Merceau would easily survive another barrage of attacks from Ahab, even if I don't break Queequeg's shield. And of course, as many heads hit as possible were needed. Come on, Merceau, go first. I trust you. Oh, God. 24. If we break shield, this is the furthest we've gotten. If we don't, then I'm not surprised. That's looking like a broken shield. Especially with Screw Loose. Go first, please. Please, 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 please go first. No. We're not staggered, but still, that's more damage than I'd like to take. Oh, this doesn't break shield, and I'm so sad. It did. Okay. We are in uncharted territory. The shield had gone down, but I had missed that 50-50. Admittedly, that was pretty lucky, all things considered. But I also had a pretty decent skill spread, especially with having another suppress on Svi Sinclair, and just not needing to use many ego in general. I also immediately got lucky the next turn. Look at the board state right now. Starbuck rolled a 4 on speed, which should have been very scary, but 4 of my IDs rolled 5 or higher, which, trust me, that just never happens. I had a good feeling. This was the run. I spent the next 2 turns finishing off Starbuck and recuperating whatever resources I could, which wasn't really much considering I needed to clash against Starbuck's attacks on that first turn. Damaging Queequeg wouldn't matter due to her passive, so she was mostly ignored. The turn following that, I finished off Starbuck and prepared for Ahab's next Prey Mark phase, and I forgot to bind her. Lucky for me, aggro was actually useful and made it so she targeted Svi Sinclair, the second best option for eating attacks. I had 1 more Chains of Others left, and resources were looking really bad, including Gloom, which was a new problem I hadn't encountered before. This was nerve-wracking, as this was the furthest I had gotten in 4.5 hours of attempts, and it was only turn 5 of Picard Trio. I still wasn't even that close. Ahab had just entered her second phase. It was all looking okay moving into the next Prey Mark onslaught. Even if my resources were all but gone, Queequeg was close to a stagger threshold. All I had to do was break the shield 1 more time, and I had a pretty good set of skills for it, but I fell just short. If I had used Snag Harpoon instead of Roseate Desire, I probably would have gotten there, but I missed it. From here, the fight is over. Svi Sinclair is swiftly killed, which, while that is incredibly based and very cool of Ahab to do that, it also means the end of this run. I tried to play it out, got some more damage on Ahab, but I knew this was a lucky run, and I was just missing too many resources. So, as I sat there, kind of staring at this fight, and after another hour of unimportant attempts that I'll spare you the luxury of, I knew I had to change something. Frustrated, and honestly a little bit burnt out, but mostly just upset, I went back to the Pallid Brigade. I didn't want to, but I had to, and some of you may have seen this coming, considering I didn't rank it on the Painometer, but I simply didn't have enough resources. I just had to hope that redoing this fight would be worth it, that it would get me through Picard Trio. Now, I don't have any footage of my run through that node again, which is why you are seeing the same footage as before, but trust me, it was more of the same. You didn't miss much of anything, and this time it took another 2 hours. And also, since I had to grind harder, my health ended up a little bit lower across the board, in no small part due to this attack here, which, by the way, just come on, man, what the fuck is this attack? 40 rupture damage? Like, seriously? Anyways, this meant my total time spent on segment 3 was already at 9 hours, and I had only just rebeat the first fight. In case you are curious, 48 turns. That is how long I spent in the Pallid Mermaids fight. Now, I also don't have footage for most of the fights I did that day on the Picard Trio node, but at this point, that's because it really became more like the Picard Town node. This is where depression truly begins to hit. I seriously could not get a run to go well. Usually the biggest problems were Lifetime Stew hitting tails, which often went hand in hand with Branch of Knowledge hitting heads. But using Branch of Knowledge to begin with would often lead to a reset due to it eating 3 precious gluttony. Since my health was lower and I knew resources were tight, my conditions for what was a playable run had become far more strict. And I also had a better idea of how many resources I would need to get me to the end. At this point, I was also in call with a bunch of people giving advice. Some solicited, some not solicited. Don't do that, by the way. That's why I didn't stream this. But some people who knew the game decently well were also there, so when I tell you that almost no stone was left unturned and no option was left unconsidered, I promise you, I mean that. Now yes, my resources were in better shape, but because of that health loss, instead of 1 usage of Lifetime Stew, 2 would be optimal. Borderline needed. I needed to bargain with the RNG gods to get them to favor me. And on that day, in that Discord call I was in for just around 7 or 8 hours, I saw Picard Trio twice. Once where I basically just instantly lost and didn't get the Screwloose Wallop RNG I needed, and then this run. This is the final Picard Trio attempt with the worst team possible. For context, to get to this point, I had hit heads on 2 Lifetime Stews and hit tails on a Branch of Knowledge. It was unfortunate it had to be used at all, but that was better luck than almost any other attempt saw. It had been another 4.5 hours of just Picard Town. But this time, Picard Town went smoothly for once. Now, I just needed a miracle to happen here too. Turn 1 goes almost exactly how I described it before, with a slightly different variation than usual in skills and clashing as you would expect. Turn 2 goes by without a hitch. Merceau is targeted, and everyone else is extremely healthy. And going into turn 3, I have Sloshmill going first. It's everything I could ask for, but could I break the shield? More importantly, after missing the coin flip 3 times total with Screwloose Wallop by this point, would I finally get lucky? Well, I had more resources to work with than what I was used to. It still wasn't great, but it meant I could afford to take this opportunity while I had it and almost guarantee Queequeg's shield would break. At this point, it was looking good. Now all I needed was for Screwloose Wallop to go first, something I would never see happen in a Picard Trio run. Pausing here for a moment, and I'm being serious, I missed this 50-50 4 times by this point, which doesn't sound ridiculous, but man, the game just could not give me a break on one of the most important parts of this fight to help me reduce my damage taken. I was so proud of this strategy, but it just never came to be. Thankfully though, Screwloose was once again just the thing I needed to push Queequeg over the edge. But now, wait, why does Starbuck have 7 speed? Yeah, turns out I have a huge disadvantage in this railway run, and that is I can't read. Not as in I'm illiterate, but Starbuck apparently has a passive that doesn't show up on him until it activates, so I cannot read it. And it's one that gives him haste when below 50% HP. This is bad. Really, really bad. I had no more Sloth. I had no chains of others to use against Starbuck to try and clash and win. All of my resource grinding somehow wasn't good enough. But there was an out. A singular way to continue this fight. My base Merceau on 15 SP needed to hit heads 3 times in a row. A 65% chance 3 times. A 27% chance total. Yeah, I spent a long time on this turn. Nervous and upset about the grim outcome, to say the least. What's worse, I wasn't even sure I would stagger Starbuck even if I won the clash. After staring at the screen for 7 whole minutes debating if there was anything else better I could be doing with my attacks, I begged Merceau to win. One, 2, 3. I wish I had the live audio because I screamed out in pure shock and amazement. He won, and it staggered Starbuck. And as cool as that was, and as lucky as the rest of this attempt is, I still lost. I played this attempt out to the very end, but it was actually still even worse than the attempt I got the night before. I'm sorry to sweep the rug out from under you, but this is how it was. This fight just would not budge. This is why this is the depression arc. I know I said it when I went into this segment. I said I knew it was likely this was just impossible. I knew I was flying too close to the sun, and yet somehow I was still genuinely upset when I got burned. At this point, I had spent just around 11 hours on Picard Trio, give or take a half an hour or so. And you heard what I said, right? That was the final attempt with the worst team possible. A failure. I told you, this team doesn't get a happy ending. I considered for a while. For a long while, actually. I asked the people in call with me what would be the most fair. I considered unbanning Regret, even though it wouldn't really help, but unbanning Regret means Merceau is no longer a bad ID since he just rolls well. So then is it even really the worst team possible still? I considered if I should just keep trying and trying and trying when what I had just gone through was really just unfun RNG again and again and again. That's not what made this challenge fun in the first place. It was solving the puzzles. It was using stuff like Tremor on Gossipium to win that fight. One I genuinely thought would be impossible turned out to be once I used the tool I hadn't thought would matter. My strategy for skin profit was so clean and was exactly what I needed for that fight, even if it did have some bullshit that wasn't explained by the game. Getting past Art Blossom Moth was RNG reliant, sure, but looking back at it, there were ways I could have mitigated that RNG if I were to do it again. I loved this run. I was so proud of getting this far, but this? My strategy was in place. It was sound. It should have worked. It was just a matter of retrying until I got the correct set of numbers to line up. But that was far from guaranteed. Because with the new setup, Picard Town was a brutal slog to even be able to see Picard Trio. So this was my lowest point during the railway. It's not even particularly close. Here, I consider just scrapping the 28 plus hours of work, because I didn't want to fall short of the expectation that last run put on me. I wanted, above all, to deliver good content, entertainment, and then the stakes I put myself through for that were just too much. But I made this video. It's uploaded on YouTube right now. You clearly know there's more to this story. So, what did I do? Well, it's simple. After depression, where do you go? Welcome to the acceptance arc. Now, I need you to bear with me. What exactly is a worst team possible? No, seriously. There are really a lot of ways you can interpret that here, especially in the railway. Is it all 12 sinners all using their worst fielded IDs possible? Well, I wasn't going to do that. That would still make the run too easy in my opinion, and some sinners really just don't have truly bad IDs. 6 horrible IDs and 6 worst support passes? Well, I tried my best. And while it is the definition I agreed most with, I think a lot of people wouldn't disagree that the worst team possible is just the worst IDs you can have on the field. Most people don't even think about support passives, how good or bad they can be, or especially how much impact they can have on a run. So, since I knew from the start this was the thing I was most willing to compromise on, and in fact, I had already compromised the integrity of the run, so let's compromise all the way. With that part of the definition removed, this meant I could finally get rid of you. Look, I like Sunshower Heathcliff an okay amount, but holy shit, I am fairly certain the amount of sanity he made me lose across the entire railway is genuinely in the 200s, so bye-bye, see you never. With that burden removed, who would I be putting on the bench for actual benefits? Well, I couldn't use Base or Chef Gregor since I wanted this team that I think proved itself to be truly terrible for this segment, to somehow win with just the backing of support passives and Zayn and Teth Ego. Base Sang was added first, whose passive is a little misleading, and not nearly as good as it really should be based on how the effect reads. This doesn't work to counteract sanity loss from things like ego, like how I thought it worked, but only specific effects that make you lose sanity. Don't ask me why this is a thing, I don't know, but I did know that this would be able to help on Pallid Mermaid's suicide sanity, since it wouldn't work on their end of turn sanity drain. Again, don't ask, I don't know why this is so specific and also so bad, but that's how it is. It was better than most of his other options anyways, so there he goes. Faust didn't really have a great slot in. Base ended up being what I went with, but it hardly ever mattered. And before you ask, no, and Faust wasn't really the play, though maybe I could have chosen her. Getting 3 Lust Resonance would have taken a bit of finesse, but I don't know. I don't think it would have been worth it. Dawn had the first significant support passive, with Meat Lantern Dawn providing 4 HP healing on hit to the ally with the highest aggro, or, well, it would be if my Meat Lantern Dawn was up type 4, so it's 2. This meant renewable health on Zwei Sinclair and Sloshmill, if only a max of 4 per turn, and only when Sloshmill didn't use Ego. It was something. Chef Ryoshi provides us with 15 healing to the lowest HP ally when we kill guys, which was great, because we kill guys pretty often, except on Picantrio, which, that's kind of where I need it the most, huh? It's still good. And then Base Heathcliff gives us some blunt damage, but wait, there's no way that's actually going to get us anywhere. We are hardly even close on Picantrio. But there's one more sinner who will be providing us with a support passive. In segment 2, I compared Base Gregor on the bench to having wax wings, just like in the Myth of Icarus. But what if Icarus was just being stupid? Instead of wax wings, why didn't he just make them out of metal? And, well, more importantly, industrial grade drugs. Introducing K-Corp Hong Lu. Now, some of you just groaned aloud and said, yeah, this makes the challenge too easy, ESGOO. First of all, not quite. Second of all, why do you sound like that? Third of all, for those who don't know what this does, at 4 Gluttony Resonance, K-Corp Hong Lu literally becomes our drug dealer and gives our lowest HP percentage ally 2 ampules of sweet, sweet healing juices. These heal 10% of our max HP a turn, which, yes, is really, really good, but at the same time, it's kind of necessary. A small boost like 5 HP healing a turn simply would not be enough to make Picantrio feasible. I like the support passive solution because if nothing else, it will show you watching that support passives can make all the difference. But hey, if you would feel better in thinking that the challenge is genuinely over at Picantrio, then yes, by all means, this is where I have failed. But it's not where I stopped, so let's keep going. Welcome back to the Pallid Brigade for the third and now final time. It's here that I can explain how K-Corp Hong Lu changed this run in a huge way. Health is now easily renewable so long as I have 4 Gluttony Resonance, and also so long as I don't accidentally kill my IDs with it. IDs die when they have 4 plus K-Corp ampules, which is 2 activations of this passive, and since it is based on lowest HP percentage, if an ID takes a whole bunch of damage and already has K-Corp ampules on them, I don't want to activate the support passive during the turns they are still the lowest HP percentage, since that would end up killing the ID. Luckily, this wasn't too hard, since the ampules reliably healed around 18 to 21 HP per turn, and yes, it is ironic that that is about the same level of healing as something like Lifetime Stew, and oh my god, I was finally relieved of the burden of having to use that absolutely awful ego for the rest of this segment. So for those of you who say these videos are hard to watch because I am torturing myself, just know this was such a huge relief. I was having fun again, which was something I hadn't really felt for a while, considering I had spent the past 15 hours combined on either this fight or Picantrio. Now, the biggest buff by far that K-Corp ampules gave me access to was infinite farming if I wanted it. I could have easily gone to 98 turns and had a bajillion resources, but come on, stalling for resources is so absurdly boring, especially when you don't have defensive skills for the sin affinity you want. I had no easy way to build up my gluttony supply, and my only way to get Sloth reliably was base Merceau's guard, which could very easily just not be able to happen due to his speed range, but you've already heard everything there is to hear about this stage by now. This time, it was just way less stressful, though the lowering of my sanity was still very annoying. I can now finally put this fight on the painometer. The first fight in this video on the painometer, an hour in. And we'll be accounting for all 3 times I did it, and all 5 hours I spent here. Those 5 hours don't really stem from this node itself being difficult, but the circumstances surrounding it, and my suboptimal play in this railway up to now. Wave 2 mermaids make this at least a 4, but considering how long I spent here, I am giving it a 5.5 out of 10 on the painometer. The sheer exhaustion I felt from playing this stage again and again is really something terrible, since the clash thresholds just generally did not favor me, and even with K-Corp ampules, though the fight was way less annoying, I cannot discount the 4 hours I spent in this stage without those sweet drugs. Speaking of, the real MVP ID/ego for this fight is K-Corp on Lu, despite not being on the field. I feel like I shouldn't have to explain why. Welcome back to Picard Trio. Though really, it feels like we never left. Health was no longer a worry. I could get quite a few ampules on my team by using Picard Town as a stepping stone, rather than something that keeps me re-rolling for literal hours. Yes, I had to re-roll for 3 gluttony skills in my lineup, but that was at least something tangible I was re-rolling for, not just as many defensive skills as possible on the enemy in the hope I get by. I could finally execute a plan and not have it die due to stupid luck. I breezed through Picard Town using similar strategies to what I had described before, but without needing to rely on the stew from the Kitchen of Hell, and I faced Picard Trio. And immediately got screwed over by speed RNG, but it wasn't quite over. Even though Merceau ended up losing his clash against Starbuck this time, Starbuck thankfully did not hit all heads, and therefore I was left alive. Staggered, but alive. Seriously, this attack is so scary. Why is he allowed to have this? This did mean no chains of others for this round of Prey Mark, but I had ampules on Zwei Sinclair, so I let him eat the Prey Mark phase this time around, which I was confident he would live, considering my past knowledge, and Queequeg's shield, once again, barely breaks. I could afford to be more reckless now. Roseate Desire didn't have to be used into Queequeg anymore, since Sloshmo could recover HP, making this more consistent due to more damage being dealt. And if you're wondering why I used Soup there, it's because I needed to change my resistances. I had ampules, but I couldn't just eat damage and take staggers for free. I still had to, and wanted to, play smart. It's not like the railway is over after this fight. After a few turns, I was back at the furthest point I had been, with ample resources and acceptable levels of sanity. It was all about keeping up the momentum and breaking Queequeg's shield, and I had managed to do just that, and slowly, after using a whole bunch of Sunshower Otises and randomly corroding into a clam, don't worry about it, I made it to this point. Now, enjoy my live play-by-play of the end of this fight. Welcome to the end of Ahab. Okay, look. I know it's not the worst team possible, but I need to make sure not to activate passives here. But we conserve pride. There's still gas harpoon. Gas harpoon could still kill me. So this is not an over railway. But it's very clear to me that even if I lose here by some stroke of unimaginable bad luck, this railway is doable. Or this fight is doable. It may only be through means that people might find bullshit and unfair and that I'm cheating, but I don't care. I determined that doing this without this is really, really, really hard. So, I mean, I'd ask, can you blame me? And maybe the answer is yes. But I want you to consider something, and that something is I don't really care. Because this was awful. Doing this was terrible. I should be conserving more resources. This is not... This is all the things you miss, by the way. All of the silent moments. Where I have to think constantly about my stuff. I farm so hard on mermaids, too. I just don't know how much is enough to kill her. I want to use chains because... this takes resources I don't care as much about. Screwless better? It shouldn't be. Should be worse. Oh, that's offense level for you. All right, this is +5. Like, why? Man. This is a fight that really took a 180. And I guess I maybe should have expected it. But I really didn't. I thought it would still be impossible. Even with K-Corp Honglu on the bench, I thought that we were screwed. But I'm glad to be proven wrong. I'd rather this than an unsatisfying. I was so worried I'd have to make some unsatisfying video with a bad conclusion. But hey, if you accept this answer of a bad team, then to be fair, the support passives are the part I was most willing to bend, always. So I'm super satisfied with this. Let's watch it go down. This should kill. If it does not, I will be extremely sad and probably cry, but I know the fight's doable, so it's not too big of a deal. I can conserve more resources if I'm forced to do it again. Hit tails. Oh, that would have been so nice. My sanity going into the Gas Harpoon's going to be bad, which I don't want, because that's already going to be a big problem of that fight. It's a shame the original strategy couldn't pan out with Rousseau eating it with chains and screw loose, because I wanted to see how little damage it would do, but I mean, Zweiklair made it work. Body breaks here. Nice. Pathos Mathos should finish it. So long and good night. Ding dong. I never thought I'd see that screen. I just wish I could do it without K-Corp Honglu. But you know, sometimes Icarus needs his metal wings. Sometimes the wax wings just aren't enough. They'll burn up. You need drugs. Onward and onward. Gas Harpoon. Yeah. To give you an idea of just how much of a resource drain that fight was, here were my resources before the fight, and here are my resources afterwards. At minimum, I would need just around that many resources, full health, and probably near perfect RNG in order to get through this fight without my K-Corp ampules and without anyone dying. But Picard Trio was only the second fight in this segment. Gas Harpoon still awaits. Finally, a change of scenery, though admittedly not by much. And I can finally talk about a fight that's not Picard. Wait, what are you doing past ESGOO? Wait, why are you backing out of the fight? I can do better. I don't like it, but I can do better. And I need to get better if Gas Harpoon's gonna be possible. So, in case you think that using K-Corp Honglu is cheap and cheating and I'm breaking the game, well, I have to do this. So, yes, I got Picard Trio like first try, but it wasn't good enough. So, let's go back. 38 Sloth, I need to conserve and farm, and like it just never ends. It just never ends. In case you ever think it's over, it's just not. All right, from the top. Okay, last time for real. this is the final time I have to talk about Pecan Trio. In case you didn't quite understand why I reset after doing only one attempt and getting barely halfway through the fight, I simply spent too many resources on Pecan Trio before. I'll talk about why that is when I talk about Gas Harpoon, but we need to properly wrap this fight up. I told you at the very beginning of this node, almost 6,300 words ago, I told you it was impossible to express how I feel about Pecan Trio, and that is true. Even though I have dedicated so much time relaying to you and recounting the misery and how this fight broke me, you don't even have the full picture. Hell, you don't even have half of the picture. You have a tiny, broken Polaroid of the pain I felt. Every small thing I kept learning, every obstacle I overcame or succumbed to, if there's any reason to not attempt this challenge for yourself, it's for Ambling Pearl. If you get past Ambling Pearl, stop, because as annoying as that fight is, this is the end of the road. And the only way I got past it was with a combined 14 plus hours of fights and the complete dismantling of my pride and dignity and the rules of this challenge. Pecan Trio is an 11 out of 10 on the painometer, nothing else comes close, and it's everything I expected it to be. I love this fight. I'm not gonna deny it. I'm glad Pecan Trio is in the game. I think there should be fights like this that stop bozos like me from winning with dog shit because it means the game is even slightly hard. MVP ID/ESGOO is once again K-Korpong Lu. Obviously it couldn't be anyone else really, but as an extremely honorable mention, Chains of Others deserves its rightful praise for making this even close to possible without K-Korpong Lu. And a dishonorable mention to Screw Loose Wallop, which never went before Ahab, despite having around 7 chances to, meaning I never got to know how little damage I would have taken. I used the strategy initially when trying to optimize the fight, but eventually I realized that the optimal play was to just not use it. I spent 2.5 more hours clearing Pecan Trio. I won't bore you with the details, but optimizing this fight was a different beast in itself. Thankfully, my initial strategies were correct enough and ampules could carry me the rest of the way from there. Now, my original script for the Pecan Trio segment ended here, but allow me just a moment's more of your time, because I need to talk about something very, very, very important, and that is that Project Moon owes me money. That's right, I want financial compensation, not this fictional lunacy. On the day this video goes up, this patch is going live, fixing an issue with Queequeg where her damage scaled incorrectly, making her deal more damage at higher HP, also known as the beginning of the fight, and also known as most of the fight, since attacking her made no sense based on the wording of the passive. This meant that the counter damage I talked about on Chef Gregor makes a lot more sense with this context. Now, I don't know how much percentage-wise this damage increase was, I'm guessing around 25 to 50%, but I will be sending my bills for therapy directly to Kim Ji-hoon's office, because god damn, how do you mess this up? Now, with that done, let's finally move on to the second to last fight, Gas Harpoon. After my 4th visit to Pecan Trio was done, I was genuinely excited. I had conserved my resources, so if anything could win against Gas Harpoon, it would be my team with this setup. This fight starts off not too bad. This is the only turn where Gas Harpoon is not at full sanity, so I took advantage of that and tried to win some clashes with non-ego skills to conserve SP that I knew would be getting devastated later. Of course, I also got a K-Corp Ampule as soon as possible. Also, you might be wondering why I'm using footage from the previous Gas Harpoon run, based on my sanity and resources, and that's because I didn't start recording properly until the second phase of Gas Harpoon for the good run. Trust me though, the first phase is basically for free, as it works about the same as it would in a normal playthrough, except that I had to deal with a ton of her regular moveset after the ego was expended. So, while these didn't clash that high, it was important to maintain sanity in order to be able to reliably clash against them with my skills that actually could clash. The Starbuck phase following the first phase isn't really notable. I knew it wouldn't be a problem anyways, but I need to mention it out of obligation. This phase did drag out for a while due to the protection she gained, but I didn't actually mind that too much, as it allowed me more time to farm resources and fish for 4 Gluttony Resonance whenever it was safe. Then, the only part that mattered. Queequeg's ego phase. This was the hardest DPS check of the railway. Looking at Gas Harpoon's resistances, she's weak to Pierce, which is the damage type I intentionally have the least of, and the only ego I have that are Pierce are Rosy Desire, Lantern, and both of Otis's ego. Yes, I could also overclock Effervescent Corrosion, but sanity was still a big concern, since every time Ahab was hit while shielded, my SP would drop by 5. So overclocking an ego for the extra sanity drain just didn't seem worth it in the long run. In a way, this worked out in my favor. I had to use ego to destroy the shield, which are all at least single coin skills, so I would generally only ever lose 5 SP from the shield, but the most important thing was breaking the shield on turn 1, since that was the turn the shield had the most HP by far. I lined up my ego with an almost completely optimal setup outside of using Lantern over Leisure Domain since I wanted to not be rash with my Gluttony, and yes, Tapathos Mathos is the better option I think because Gas Harpoon is Pride Weak and because it means I could go just about neutral on my sanity instead of about 10 negative. So I watched, nervous that I would be way off of breaking it. The shield is broke. Oh, we aren't out of the woods yet. That's the first break. By only just about 15 damage, I managed to break her shield. But this next turn, Chef Gregor was staggered. Thankfully, she had lost some of her ego, meaning it had less health. So I loaded up on ego once again, and luckily I hit heads at very opportune times. I think this is the first time in the Railway I ever wanted to see Branch of Knowledge roll heads, due to the higher number, and especially the 12 Rupture application. From here, the fight was basically solved. The counter was being used less, the extra shield HP was dwindling, and then we barely got there each time. Dude, no way is that possible without K-Corp ampules. Oh my god, we aren't done yet. But I know that it's very likely doable. I'm gonna keep going. Ah, so she just always has a 10% max HP shield, huh? I never really thought about that. That's bullshit. Damn. I guess we really aren't done. Damn. With no sloth left, I had gotten rid of all of Gas Harpoon's Queequeg ego. However, the turn after she was done being staggered, she was using the counter again, and still gaining 10% of her max HP and shield. I didn't actually know this going into the fight, because, I mean, whenever you do a normal playthrough, she's kind of just dead by this point. This meant I needed to still apply as much pressure as possible and take advantage of how stagger works in Limbus once again, pushing her over the edge of being staggered at the start of the turn instead of in the middle or end. I was confident I could somewhat keep up the damage race, but my sanity was being drained, and I wasn't ready to account for more SP loss than what I had already sustained. Looking at my skills, I really didn't have any good damaging options. It was all ego. And if I didn't break the shield just one time, she would regain her ego and make it even worse the following turns. Thankfully, I was worrying over nothing. I still had plenty of uses of Roseate Desire, which dealt great damage and crippled Ahab's rolls, making it so I could take clashes I really should not have been able to, and as luck would have it, I had Gas Harpoon right where I wanted her, on the precipice of being staggered. Then, only a few turns later of relatively easy clashing due to Roseate Desire... Oh my god. I can't play the desktop audio for this, because Compass is playing, but this is like genuinely emotional. I thought I would get blocked at Picard Trio. I know it's cheating. But look at this team. Did you ever think you'd see this screen? Because I didn't. The fact that they can do it with just this, I know Keiko Rampiles are super strong, but no one thought they could break the shield. And that was mostly with base ego. The first one I used Effervescent, but not even the corroded version. Like, just Zayn and Tethigo and a K-Corp Hong Lu on the bench. That's insane. Oh, let's send it off. I want Gloom. Sloth, obviously. We can have Zweiklair end it off. I really don't want to risk anything, but this should kill. Min rolls are 6. 8, 14. No, okay. Then add in Chef Gregor. Gluttony skill. 16. 24. 32. Odds I min roll are low. I'm adding this one. I can't optimize that. I can't optimize that heavy. Just end it. So we're getting the gluttony. I mean... now we're on the spiral. Last fight of the railway. Time for a whole new team. It's over. The hurdle has been cleared. With a little bit of help from our good friends, drugs. It was over. Segment 3 was done. Unlike Pallid Mermaids or Picard Trio, which I went back to multiple times, I would not be going back to see Gas Harpoon again. God, no. So, before I introduce you to the final team of the challenge, let me just talk about how insane that was. Looking back at the footage, I got absurd luck. I managed to get basically 2 turns of stagger on both Starbuck and Queequeg phases of the fight, netting me a lot of resources and precious damage on the Queequeg phase. I'm glad I didn't try and brute force it on my first clear, since I really don't think it would have worked out. My resources and especially my sanity were just far too low. The 2.5 extra hours I spent on Picard Trio I think paid off in dividends and were worth it for getting this fight on my second try. As I said in those clips, I really struggle to see how even if this team had managed to get past Picard Trio with no deaths, unless you had saved and conserved resources like a pro, I think the run dies at Gas Harpoon, and dies hard. Gas Harpoon itself in this run, though, wasn't a huge burden, but it represented something else. It represented getting past the fight I thought would be the end before. I had resigned myself to not seeing the results screen for this railway, and just quitting out right before this fight. Overcoming that, it felt really good. Gas Harpoon gets a 4 out of 10 on the painometer. The threat of this fight was scarier than the fight itself, if that makes sense, but of course I also never got here without K-Corp ampules, so this number is definitely skewed. MVP ID/ego, K-Corp Hong Lu, blah blah blah, but really, to Pathos Mathos. It was my best damaging option, though what is cast actually did pretty well too despite being Slash, since it was Pride and deals extra damage to enemies above 50% HP, which Gas Harpoon was when it was at its scariest. That's all I have to say about Gas Harpoon, but before we move on to Spiral and the new team, let's recap this section in terms of hours and resets. Coming out of Segment 3, the Pallid Brigade took just around 5 hours, and had about 10 to 15 resets. It's weirdly comparable to Skin Profit in Segment 2. It also took 44 turns on my final clear, which is also close to Skin Profit's 41 turns. Picard Trio took way too fucking long, also known as just about 14 to 15 hours. It's really hard to keep track of this one in particular since it took just so long and was attempted over the span of 3 days, which no other fight got the honor of, and the amount of resets, while completely unknowable, is definitely at least in the low 100s, but most of those were instant resets for defensive skill RNG on turn 1. Then Gas Harpoon took just around an hour and a half, with about 5 resets total, with most of those being around the beginning of the fight both times I attempted it for 4 Gluttony Resonance resetting, and a total of 24 turns. This means that our total time for this segment using a low ball estimate was 21 hours. For context, all of Railway 2 with the worst team possible, all 29 of those fights, took just around that amount of time. And here, I cheated heavily. Otherwise, I could have and would have spent way more hours with little chance of success. But this video does not end now. It was time for Terminus. This is the last fight of the railway, and it needed its own team. So let's talk about that quickly since you already know all of the candidates. Spiral of Contempt is a really weird abnormality, having no weaknesses and resisting everything heavily. This technically means everything should be allowed, but there's an abnormality check that allows you to choose a damage type and sin affinity to make Spiral weak to. A lot of people suggested to me that I don't take the check, and while I understand where that mentality comes from, this challenge is not about me playing as bad as possible. If there's something within a fight that I can use to my advantage, why shouldn't I use it? The thing that had to be as bad as possible was my team building, and in that sense, goodbye good support passives. Yeah, I loved having them, but it wouldn't feel right to end it off this way. This meant my only form of healing was once again Lifetime Stu Sinclair, and Sunshower Heathcliff was once again on the bench. Finally, a return to form. In terms of my team, I considered returning to the OG Railway 2 Worst team as a bit of a throwback, minus Base Faust because she's boring, but as much as I wanted to do that, and I'm sure no one would have blamed me, I decided to make my damage types as varied as was reasonable, as well as my sin affinities. This meant that while I could take advantage of the check to give me better damage, it wouldn't be as easy as picking blunt, and then only having blunt damage on my team. I determined the team that would be best, and therefore the worst for this, would be Base Rodian, Base Faust, Base Merceau, Zwei Sinclair, BL Otis, and Chef Gregor. A bias towards blunt really couldn't be avoided, but having quite a bit of slash and some pierce still lowered my overall damage output. And the sin affinities were pretty all over the place, but pride was the only standout just due to my ego. With all of that out of the way, Spiral of Contempt. Look, at the end of Railway 2, Sign of Roses awaited me after what I had considered at the time to be a grueling journey. And it was an easy fight, because I had saved Envy to use Fluid Sac. Can you imagine? Seriously, imagine how much easier this run would be if I had access to a 5 AoE ego that also healed 15% of my max HP and 15 SP. That aside, Sign of Roses was a joke, and while it led to what is probably the funniest joke I will ever make on this channel, Spiral, well, I secretly hoped it would be the same thing. A fight I could quickly run through as a victory lap. Now, would you believe me if I said that this took longer than Picard Trio? You shouldn't, that's a lie. But this was also not a joke fight, and my mentality had to shift back properly. I had no more failsafes, so one last time, let's talk about the problems. Spiral of Contempt's issues are actually pretty basic. It has some pretty nasty rolls and demands constant attention, and also consistency. Its on-hit effects suck pretty bad, especially the attack done by the hands, which inflicts a ton of bleed and was Pierce, a damage type I was still pretty damn fatal to. The main debate of this fight, though, was how do I handle the grasp mechanic. This was how I would get it to the abnormality check in order to make it less resistant to blunt and pride, but it would require me to lose control of one of my IDs temporarily, and then break them out before 3 turns passed. My initial strategy was actually to not do this. You see, my resources were yeah, no, not good. Even though I had an optimized Picard Trio fight, Gas Harpoon still filtered out almost all of my sloth, and I was confident I didn't need to go back to Gas Harpoon, and by confident, I mean I just didn't want to go back to Gas Harpoon. My plan ultimately was to just chill out, and that didn't really work. Again, Spiral has a really high offense level. For reference, Base Merceau was rocking a 37 offense level, meaning Spiral gained 5 clash power over me. Merceau's usually reliable skill 2 now needed at least one of the coins in Spiral's skills to hit tails in order to win, and if I didn't want to take those odds, Ego had to be used. And it didn't help that my sanity started off pretty bad, and I mean, there's just nothing to be done about that considering Gas Harpoon. Thankfully, after being basically unable to use it to any good effect in Segment 2 and regrettably not having it at all in Segment 3, I actually could use Representation Emitter to heal my SP. I needed to conserve both Pride and Gluttony, of course, but this was a worthy use of my resources. I couldn't just conserve forever and ever, so this was one of my best options. I did keep losing, though, for quite a while, actually. I was clearly missing something. And even if I got to the abnormality check and started dealing good damage, Spiral would put me on a timer. One that, in my Railway 3 guide, I said didn't really matter. And in normal gameplay, I still stand by that. This is not normal gameplay. I hadn't yet gotten to the point where that timer would become a problem, though. Spiral's regular attacks really just walled me out entirely, and it wasn't helped by this mass attack used every couple of turns. While it reset my gaze, which was nice since I didn't want to become contempt and lower my already terrible damage, it was a scary one to clash with, especially when speed ranges and aggro were a pain once again. After about an hour, I got on a pretty good attempt. It's not like I did anything particularly special. I was pretty burnt out on a thinking and proper brain function after going through segment 3, so I was really only half there. But the main strategy came down to using Paralyze. Chef Gregor's skill 1 and 3 were key here, and this is the fight that made me take Legerdemain to Threadspin 4, since Gregor's sanity was often too low to consistently hit heads, and it was just too good to pass up on. Spiral also had no negative coin skills, meaning Paralyze was always a benefit. The issue with spamming Legerdemain was fueling Legerdemain. On paper, my team wasn't the worst at it. I had plenty of gluttony skills, but Sloth was the real killer, since it was used in a lot of ego I wanted to use often, and it was hard to keep up with the demand. However, Legerdemain was probably the biggest value I could get out of a single Sloth, though Chains of Others was also something that really stood out as useful, so yeah, Sloth generation was the top priority. During this attempt in particular, I was actually forced into breaking base Faust free of the grasp. This was probably the second worst ID to have be grasped, since the best way to free the IDs were via AoE attacks, of which I only had 2 real ones if Faust was unable to attack, and no, Lifetime Stew does not fucking count as an AoE ego, don't even joke about that. Using some face-tanking strategies that should probably violate some kind of Limbus Company policy, I did manage to break base Faust free. The real fight starts here. My Tremor stack was already set up, because, what else was I supposed to do? Come on. So now started the lengthy process of dealing damage to Spiral of Contempt, and really, there's not much else to say. During this attempt, I learned a lot, but at the end of the day, I got Spiral too low on HP too quickly, starting my timer too fast. This meant my health and SP drained, and everyone corroded, and I just wasn't quite ready for it. So I'll let you look at the neat animations that you probably don't see every day while I tell you exactly what I learned. Most of it was that what I was doing was correct. Waiting a long while to activate the abnormality check was the correct play, since it meant I had some turns to build up a small bit of a nest egg, since I was going to need to throw everything I had at Spiral to kill it before it killed me. Thankfully, I did not need to hold anything back. This was the last fight. Deaths, damage, resources, none of it mattered. So long as I closed it out, even if literally all of my IDs died, who cares? Because I won. Wait a second, even if all of them died? So you're saying it was Sloshmal's time, the redemption arc, the ID I threw to the roses to burn and suffer was going to close out Railway 3. Okay, never mind, she couldn't do it. In truth, I did want Sloshmal to close out this railway, as a fun little mirror to the ending of Railway 2, but this fight just wasn't easy enough for me to bend to my silly little narrative. This was a genuinely difficult fight that I didn't expect. Nothing along the lines of Glam, or Trio, or anything like that, but I was now 2 hours deep. I went again, this time with a firm strategy. Restart until I won literally every clash on turn 1 for sanity, then stall. Yep, it's brilliant, I know. This just ensured I wasn't wasting my time more than was necessary. Even if the clash was struggling, just take it, since there was a chance I would win. This did pay off, and I had a run that went well, and I started recording it on turn 6. I spent a while just resetting until I got the actual luck I needed, and immediately on turn 7, things went wrong. You see, a lot of the burden for clashing was put on Beal Otis and base Faust evading the attack from the hands. Faust's evade rolled worse, but she was at least pierce resistant. Otis, I had to actively not use Sun Shower, since that would make my Sin resistances terrible for this fight, and she was Pierce Fatal. So missing that evade already sucked. And then I somehow forgot to clash against It Shall Constrict, meaning I was going to have to do the abnormality check at an accelerated pace. This was doable still, of course, but not optimal. Thankfully, I already knew that Zwei Sinclair was by far my best option to get gripped. During the turns he was on that pedestal, he couldn't be damaged by the abnormality, and Lifetime Stew was, begrudgingly, kind of needed for this fight. At least once, just for safety. So this is actually a fine strategy to, ironically enough, conserve his HP. After winning my abnormality check, which was always stressful by the way, since missing either Base Merceau's skill 2 or Weiss and Claire's skill 3 would mean a restart, but I got the luck I needed here. I kept playing slow. Just because Spiral was more vulnerable didn't mean I needed to be rash. I would try to play patiently until I started getting the all-beholding gaze debuff on me, and then rush him down. On turn 17 of this fight though, something amazing happened. The last usage of Lifetime Stew in my Railway 3 worst team career. So, you in the audience, place your bets. Heads or tails? Welcome to the last soup segment of the run. I have a very important message for you, so listen close. Fuck this ego! Holy shit, I never want to see it again! Do not mention this shit to me anywhere. Do not let people gaslight you into thinking its awakening version has any use other than activating the ego passive for burn teams, and even then, I think I would rather shove Papa Bongi's ladle into my eye socket than use this ego again in any context or content. Anyways, finally on turn 21, which that number really should faze me, goes to show just how much things have changed, but on turn 21, it was time. The timer had started, and my health and SP were slowly being drained. Representation Emitter would keep my team sane, and was my best damaging option because it was AoE and Pride Blunt. Things got really close near the end, but since I was spamming Representation Emitter, no one fully corroded, which was really important. And on turn 24 of Spiral of Contempt, it all came down to one final clash. A 65% chance to hit heads on Legerdemain determined if I won or lost. I'll let past ESGOO take it away. Please. Please, don't. I can't do this fight again. Oh god. Let's go. Oh, it's over. Oh, we're done. Oh, we're done. Oh, we're done. Oh, we're done. It is pretty sticky. You won't dodge this. And he's done. Refraction Railway 3 with the worst teams possible with like a big asterisk, but... Oh my god. Really? Really? I guess okay, Sun Shower. Yeah. Oh my god. What a fucking challenge that what a fucking challenge. I went on to rant for about 10 minutes at the end there, but I have decided to spare you from that. You are welcome. Spiral of Contempt took me just around 2.5 hours, bringing our total rough estimated time spent on this stupid challenge to 38 hours total. Here's the final results screen, with all the turn counts visible to you, and I will put on screen the time and resets for each fight. Remember, these are rough estimates. It sounds impossible, but even though I have made 3 separate videos totaling just around 3.5 hours of content, there is more I could say. Strategies for fights I skipped over, especially in this video. In fact, let me just put as many of them as I can think of in the moment on screen now. I know the ending of this railway, having to use a really good support passive to get by, doesn't exactly inspire confidence to anyone nervous to take on this railway. But let me just reiterate to you. If you watched all this way, this whole journey, and you still think you can't beat this railway, you are wrong. I don't want to keep ranting for much longer. I've already kept you here long enough, God knows, and I think you already know how I feel about most of these IDs, but in case you don't, all of these suck. Base Merceau, who is my choice for the MVP of the railway on the whole, is very based, and yeah, that sounds weird, but his skill 2 Bursting Tremor and having by far the biggest clutch factor made me appreciate him a lot. Another MVP was definitely Effervescent Corrosion Rhodian and just Tremor on the whole, which was just super cool to actually use, finally. And one last piece of advice. Don't try this challenge. It is fun in a lot of ways, but the parts that are miserable are so miserable that they don't really make it worth it. And yet I fully plan to do it again. Next time, hopefully, without breaking my rules. So with that, thank you for watching. Seriously, if you watched every second of the Railway Challenge, that's close to 4 hours of watching me do this act of masochism. And in that time frame, I still would not have beaten Gossipium, and several other fights. Of course, thank you for 20,000 subscribers. This was kind of meant as a subscriber special of sorts, and though fully editing a video like this in my usual style would be impossible in a week, just know that I spent a lot of time on this as a thank you to you. Knowing that so many people watch and enjoy my content is amazing, and I hope my videos continue to match your expectations. Being your Limbus funny man is an honor. Most times. Sometimes people ask to stab me in my DMs, but outside of that, thank you. This video ends now.